When we talk of the past and London's poor, we often think of the East End, but poverty existed in pockets of the city long before swathes of terraces began to stretch eastwards, and remained long after. St Giles and Seven Dials, for example, were two notorious examples of West End slums present in the early Victorian era, before road realignments and demolition of buildings drove out the population into other crowded neighbourhoods. Indeed, the construction of Regent Street, completed in 1825, intentionally cut right through the homes of working-class families, forming a divide between wealthy Mayfair to its west and the shadowy alleys of Soho to its east. You can find out more about the history and terrible conditions for people living in these slums in videos available on this channel. See the description for links. Today, in an eyewitness account by a Victorian journalist, you will discover how Marylebone in West London, another famous and wealthy quarter of the capital, was once a very different place, well known today as a fashionable inner-city destination for boutique shops, fine dining, high-class hotels and world-renowned medical practices in distinguished locations, such as Marylebone High Street, Baker Street, Harley Street and Portland Place, to name but a few. But it wasn't always so. It's true that, in the past, London's well-to-do had a home here in many a grand Georgian mansion lining elegant tree-lined avenues laid out by the city's wealthy landowners. That facade, however, hid a very different world in the 1860s. For in courts, alleys and mews, behind the houses of the rich were working-class families of several people, living in small, squalid and overcrowded homes. Find out how many of these pest houses, as our reporter calls them, in Marylebone, were not just owned by unscrupulous landlords, but by the Crown and the Church, and how sometimes people lived in hovels above stables, in conditions little better than the animals below, and discover how, in Lisson Grove, bordering Marylebone and Edgware Road, rapid urbanisation around Regent's Canal brought huge social consequences: overcrowding, squalor, crime, and prostitution. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. If large factories and centres of industry invariably attract a crowded, dependent population, terraces and squares of private mansions do the same. From Belgravia to Bloomsbury, from St Pancras to Bayswater, there is hardly a settlement of leading residences that has not its particular colony of ill-housed poor hanging on to its skirts. Behind the mansion there is generally a stable, and near the stable there is generally a maze of close streets, containing a small greengrocer's, a small dairy, a quiet coachman's public house, and a number of houses let out in tenements. These houses shelter a large number of painters, bricklayers, carpenters, and similar labourers, with their families, and many laundresses and charwomen. Each room, with a few exceptions, is the home of a different family, and the kitchens are often more crowded than any other parts of the house. This is particularly the case in old and faded neighbourhoods, and it is also the case in Marylebone, near the Regent's Park. Squares and terraces that are scarcely 30 years old are still surrounded by hopelessly faded streets, some of them builders' mistakes, and others designedly built for the class who now occupy them. They all bear a melancholy family likeness to each other. Their street doors are always open, a few trucks are generally standing in the gutter, a marine store dealer's coloured placard sticks out prominently from one of the houses, and a flock of chickens are always strutting in the road. They often contain much uncomplaining poverty. Many of their inhabitants cherish a spirit of independence, which a long course of intrusive visiting charity has not been able to crush. In the district of St Paul's, Marylebone, a neighbourhood lying to the right of Lisson Grove, as you enter from the New Road, there are many streets that answer to this description. Byron Street, Brand Street, Bridport Street are all filled with houses let out in tenements, each room fetching a rental of 3 shillings or 3 shillings and sixpence a week, and containing a large family. Externally, the 2 latter streets look like what are called genteel thoroughfares. Several families will be gathered under one roof. Most of these families will have 6 members of both sexes, some grown to the age of youth, and each house will thus contain a dense population of poor working people in a very small space. Many of these poor lodgers, when periodically pressed, will sell everything saleable, even to their clothes, rather than ask for a sixpence from the local charities. The Reverend Mr. Keeling, who watches over the district, assures me that 1/2 of his parishioners, or about 5,000 people, have nearly all their garments in pawn at the present moment. The exchange of goods for money at pawnbrokers was commonplace when funds were short, and also a way of keeping valuables, which included clothes, safe from theft. Many have told the visiting clergyman that a year's constant work with the greatest thrift on their part will hardly raise them out of the distress into which they have fallen. Boston Place is an example of a lower class of settlement, lying halfway between the position of a court and a street. The houses exhibit every stage of squalor and wretchedness. The rooms are let at about 2 shillings or 2 and sixpence a week. The huddling together is even more extreme and unwholesome, and the place is a harbour for a few thieves and prostitutes. A common mews let out to cabmen, very often a decayed collection of private or livery stables, is a very usual feature in such neighbourhoods as this, and Huntsworth Mews, in this district, is a fair sample of these places. The yard and stables are dirty and neglected. The stable helps are brown with filth, and over each stable is a low, close room, containing a family more or less numerous. The stable population in this district numbers about 100 families. This is the side of Lisson Grove which is supposed to contain the decent poor, and on the other side, in the streets leading into the Edgware Road, is a more densely crowded and even lower population. Bell Street, now famous in history as the spot where Turkish baths were first established, is the main stream of a low colony, with many tributary channels. There is no particular manufacture in the neighbourhood to call the population together. A great number are not dependent upon St. John's Wood or the Regent's Park for a living, and they come together simply because they like the houses, the rents, the inhabitants, and the general tone of living in the settlement. Somers Town, Shoreditch, and the New Cut, Lambeth, are here repeated in their principal features, and the whole place looks like a flourishing branch of some great central bank of costermongers, dingy brokers' shops, and labourers. They have a marvellous power of lowering the standard of comfort and cleanliness in any court, street, or colony in which they appear, and certain sewer-like alleys near the Islington Turnpike, certain back streets in the neighbourhood of Manchester Square, not to go over the water or to the east of London, are exactly like certain gardens or places in this part of Marylebone. Some of these gardens, Smith's Gardens for example, contain dwarfed cottages, very battered and dirty, standing in black yards, and are the evident remains of Marylebone as a village. In such places you will generally find a sweep or a dustman, and the bit of ground in front of each hut is more convenient to receive saleable refuse than a kitchen or a back parlour. Some of the streets, I may mention George Street, are notorious haunts of thieves, prostitutes, and the lowest threepenny lodging houses, and in this case the blot upon the district is not made more foul by being the property of a parish officer. Rate collectors, registrars, and active vestrymen are too often the proprietors of these places, making an extra profit by their local knowledge. Sometimes the land such pest houses stand upon is crown or church property, and the rent, and more, has to be expended in the work of counteracting their influence. There are no courts and alleys in this neighbourhood such as disgrace the east of London. The avenues are so broad that they may be almost classed as streets. The roadways are paved. There is no open drain trickling down the centre, and none that I saw were disfigured with public privies. The entrances, in 1 or 2 cases, were low archways, with pathways covered with various kinds of filth, but the interiors were open and fairly ventilated. I should prefer living in a hut in Smith's Gardens to living in a kitchen or back parlour in the St. Paul's district. The Christchurch division of Marylebone, in which Bell Street and all its ramifications stand, is watched over by the Reverend Llewellyn Davies. The whole population of this crowded district is estimated at 30,000, and it embraces the worst part of the parish. The parochial work in such an area, which contains at least 16,000 idle and industrious poor, is necessarily very heavy, and, on the whole, it appears to be conducted sensibly and energetically. The principle of self-help, the only principle that tends to assist the poor without demoralizing them, is adopted in every practical way, and the pure charities are numerous and well conducted. There are 4 classes of schools for boys, girls, and infants, where a small weekly payment is exacted. There is a special Sunday school for children not attending the day schools. There are free evening classes in connection with the Sunday school, and similar classes at another school for lads, men, and girls. A working party is held weekly to which mothers of families may bring work, and at which they receive friendly advice and assistance as to household management. No healthy educational agency is neglected. Amongst the self-supporting institutions is a Provident Fund, which numbered 1,250 depositors of small sums in 1860, and an amount deposited of £1,000. No money paid into this fund is returned in any form except in tickets for necessaries. There is also a benefit club coming under this head, where members are entitled to receive certain payments during illness. Amongst the charities is a relief fund, the chief objects of which are to lend blankets, money, in small sums not exceeding £5 without interest, to make allowances to the sick, and to supply linen and other comforts to women lying in during childbirth. The number of indoor poor at the Marylebone Workhouse, the 18th of January, 1860, amounting to 2,039, would people a small town, whilst there are 3,332 on the books receiving outdoor relief, and in addition to these numbers, 2,851 have had casual relief during the last week. The cost of the relief of the poor during the year has been £53,500. For all this, such a public scandal as the death of an old woman from starvation on the workhouse steps on Christmas Day, 1860, has not been avoided, and the following case presents even more painful features. I quote the newspaper report. Some excitement was occasioned yesterday, the 25th of December 1860, in the neighbourhood of Lisson Grove, by the discovery of a poor deaf and dumb man in a dying state, from shocking neglect and destitution in one of Hedges' cottages, Chapel Street, Edgware Road. The discovery was made, it appears, by Anne Dunn, a resident of number 3, Hedges Cottages, who at once called the attention of the police to the unfortunate man. He was found in an almost naked state, frightfully dirty and emaciated, presenting the appearance of long-standing neglect, and of not having tasted food for days. He was removed in a helpless but sensible condition upon a stretcher to the St. Marylebone Workhouse, where he was immediately admitted, and evinced much delight at the kind treatment and attention which was readily given him by the officers of the house. Mr. Fuller, the resident surgeon, immediately attended him, and at first some hopes were entertained of his recovery, but he expired about 2 hours after his admission. His name, it has been ascertained, is Robert Hussey, aged 45, and his death is a melancholy instance of the shocking destitution of the metropolis even at Christmas. The Reverend Mr. Davies, writing upon metropolitan distress in February 1861, has the following remarks in defence of the parochial administration of this workhouse. I admit, however, that notwithstanding the good intentions of the board, the results of their administration are by no means of a kind that would defy criticism, not to speak of the insuperable difficulties of a constant weary struggle against vice, and idleness, and fraud. The management of so vast a business as that of St. Marylebone Workhouse requires great administrative capacity and constant vigilance, and a board of 30 perfectly equal members, elected every year, does not promise much efficiency in government. But even if such blots were more numerous and discreditable than they are, it is obvious, and no well-informed person could forget it, that the substantial relief of the poor is, and must be, the work of the guardians, and that the better this work is done, the less the public hear of it. At the same time, the public have ample opportunities of knowing what is going on at the workhouse, through the meetings open to ratepayers and reporters, at the workhouse and the vestry, and through the reports in the local newspapers. But the Poor Law administration does not remove distress, nor pretend to do it. No system of relief, however charitable, could possibly put an end to distress. The causes of physical misery, whilst they remain, make that misery inevitable. In those instances of undoubted destitution which have been detailed before the magistrates, and elsewhere, we do not know how much is due to drunkenness, that plague and curse of our poor. And how can you keep a drunkard out of want? Another cause of distress is scarcely less difficult to cope with, the imbecility and want of energy which infect some persons like a disease. Then there is the downright idleness of not a few, which keeps them from seeking work, and throws them out of occupation when they get it. The destitution which arises from sickness and misfortune, the character of the sufferers having been reasonably good, ought to be relieved humanely by the workhouse, if not more indulgently cared for, as one might surely hope it would be, by the kindness of friends, and by Christian charity.